The sky over the Badlands was the color of a fresh bruise, a sullen purple-gray that promised a storm, the likes of which could peel the hide from a dead steer. Eli Kerrigan felt the coming rain in the ache of his ribs, where a cattleman's boot had connected 2 weeks prior, and in the throb of the bullet graze high on his left shoulder. He rode, slumped in the saddle, a man trying to make himself small against a world that had grown too large and loud with his name. His horse, a weary, dun gelding named Dust, plodded onward, its head low, as if it shared its rider's exhaustion. The town appeared without ceremony, a handful of weathered buildings huddled together in a shallow basin as if for protection from the ceaseless wind. A faded sign, swinging on one hinge, declared the place Providence. It was a name too hopeful for a place that looked like it had been forgotten by God and man alike. Dust tasted the air, smelling water and hay, and picked up its pace without any command from Eli. He let the horse lead, his own eyes scanning the single dusty street. There was a general store with a boarded window, a saloon whose bat-wing doors hung unnervingly still, a livery, and a squat building with a tarnished star nailed to the door that passed for a sheriff's office. What struck Eli was the quiet. It was not the peaceful quiet of a sleepy afternoon. It was a held breath, listening sort of quiet. A woman shaking a rug on her porch froze when she saw him, her hands still in the air, before she bundled the rug inside and shut the door with a solid thud. A pair of old men sitting on a bench outside the store stopped their whittling and simply stared, their faces as blank and uninviting as the sun-bleached planks they sat on. No one offered a nod or a word of greeting. They just watched, their eyes filled with a flat, weary suspicion that Eli knew all too well. It was the look of people who expected trouble and had learned that the best way to survive it was to pretend it was not there. He was running, not from the law, not directly, but from a posse of men paid by a rich rancher who did not take kindly to his foreman quitting after a dispute that ended with the rancher's son nursing a broken jaw. The rumors, carried on the wind like pollen, said they were calling themselves bounty hunters now, adding a veneer of legality to what was simple, ugly revenge. Providence seemed like the kind of place a man could disappear in for a night or two, a place so small and insignificant it would be overlooked. But this heavy, coiled tension felt wrong. It felt worse than the threat at his back. As he dismounted in front of the livery, the scent of horse and old leather a familiar comfort, he saw the source of the town's strange mood. At the far end of the street, just beyond the last shanty, a large canvas tent had been raised. A banner, flapping in the rising wind, was painted with bold, righteous letters. "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Brother Josiah's crusade for souls." Revival meetings? Eli had seen their kind before. Preachers who rolled into town with fire in their eyes and a hand ready for the collection plate. They could stir up a town's fervor or its fears, depending on which paid better. But there was something else here. Parked near the main tent was a long, covered wagon, its canvas sides buttoned down tight despite the heat of the afternoon. It seemed separate from the rest of the camp, guarded by a grim-faced man with a shotgun held loose in his arms. Eli handed the reins of his horse to the stable owner, a stoop-shouldered man named Henderson, whose eyes darted from Eli to the tent and back again. "Just for the night," Eli said, his voice a low rasp. "Grain and water for the horse. I'll take a stall in the loft." Henderson nodded, not meeting his gaze. "That'll be 4 bits. For the horse." He wiped his sweaty hands on his apron. "Loft's free, I suppose. Not many travelers stopping these days." "Why's that?" Eli asked, though he already suspected the answer was tied to the tent down the road. The stableman's gaze flickered. "Brother Josiah. He preaches a hard gospel. Says the town is wallowing in sin. Folks get tense." He took the coins from Eli's hand, his fingers barely brushing Eli's skin. "He's got wards with him. Young women, orphans, he says, looking to find good, Christian husbands to build new lives with." The words hung in the air, heavy and sour. Eli had heard of such arrangements. Girls from Eastern orphanages or mission houses, shipped west with promises of a home and a family. Sometimes finding just that, but more often finding themselves tied to men twice their age with hard hands and harder hearts. It was a trade, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of salvation. Curiosity, a dangerous thing for a man trying to lie low, got the better of him. As dusk began to settle, smearing the bruised sky with streaks of orange and blood red, he walked toward the revival tent. The wind was stronger now, whipping dust into his eyes and carrying the sound of a reedy organ and earnest, off-key singing. A small crowd of townsfolk was gathered on simple wooden benches, their faces upturned toward a large, barrel-chested man on a makeshift stage. This had to be Brother Josiah. He had a thick, flowing beard and a voice that boomed with the certainty of a man who believed God spoke directly into his ear. "And the Lord provides," Brother Josiah thundered, his arms spread wide. "He provides for the lonely man, the righteous farmer, the God-fearing smithy who seeks a helpmate to share in his toil and build a family under the watchful eye of the Almighty." As if on cue, a thin, severe-looking woman led a line of girls out from behind the stage. There were 5 of them, all young, dressed in plain, drab dresses of gray and brown that did nothing to hide how thin and tired they were. They stood with their heads bowed, their hands clasped before them. The crowd murmured, a mixture of pity and appraisal. It was a market, and these girls were the livestock. Brother Josiah began to speak of their virtues, of their piety and their eagerness to serve a good husband. Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He was about to turn away, disgusted, when his eyes landed on the last girl in the line. She was paler than the others, with a cascade of dark, unbound hair that the wind teased around her face. She was trembling, a fine, continuous shiver that shook her whole frame. While the other girls kept their eyes fixed on the ground, she lifted her head, her gaze sweeping over the crowd with a desperate, hunted look. Her eyes were wide and dark, filled with a terror so profound it was like looking into a deep, dark well. For a heartbeat, her eyes met Eli's. There was no plea in them. Not really. It was something deeper, a silent scream of a trapped animal that knows the cage door is about to close for good. Then, as quickly as it happened, her gaze dropped, and she was just another bowed head in a line of forgotten girls. Eli did not know her name, but the image of her face, of those terrified eyes, was burned into his mind. He turned and walked back to the livery, the preacher's booming voice chasing him down the street. He felt the familiar urge to saddle his horse and ride, to put this town and its quiet cruelties behind him, the storm, the bounty hunters, his own weary soul. It was all enough. He did not need to take on the ghost of a frightened girl. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the scent of dry alfalfa a welcome relief from the town's cloying tension. He settled into a pile of loose hay in a dark corner, his back against the rough-hewn wooden wall. The wind howled outside, rattling the stable doors. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's face. Hours passed. The rain began to fall, first as fat, sporadic drops that pinged against the tin roof, then as a steady, driving downpour. The revival meeting had long since ended, the town plunging into an inky blackness broken only by a few faint yellow squares of lamplight. It was in a lull between claps of thunder that he heard it. A voice, raised in anger, carried from the direction of the evangelist's camp. It was a man's voice, thick and slurred. It was followed by a woman's cry, sharp and then abruptly muffled, as if a hand had been clamped over her mouth. Eli sat up, every nerve ending tingling. It was not his business. He repeated the words to himself like a prayer. Not my business. He had learned the hard way what happened when he made other people's troubles his own. He had lost everything that mattered because of it. He lay back down, pulling his hat over his eyes, trying to block out the sound and the memory. But then he heard a sob. It was a desperate, broken sound, the kind of weeping that comes from the deepest part of a soul that has given up all hope, and it was coming from the direction of that long, covered wagon. He thought of the girl with the haunted eyes. Damn it all, he breathed into the darkness. He moved with a fluid silence that belied his aching body. He slipped down the ladder, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He kept to the shadows, the pouring rain masking his movements and soaking him to the bone in seconds. The revival tent was dark and empty, flapping wildly in the wind. The guard was gone from his post, likely seeking shelter from the downpour. A single lantern cast a weak, flickering light from within the covered wagon, making the wet canvas glow. The angry voice came again from inside. Closer now. I paid a good price. Brother Josiah promised a compliant girl, not a willful little cat who needs her claws clipped. Then he heard her voice, small and trembling. Please, no, you cannot. It is a sin. The only sin, the man grunted, his voice thick with effort, is a wasted investment. Eli reached the back of the wagon and lifted a corner of the canvas flap. The scene inside was a murky tableau of shadows and weak light. A large, fleshy man with a sweat-sheened face had the girl pinned against a pile of crates. It was her, the pale girl with the terrified eyes. Her drab dress was torn at the shoulder, and she was struggling weakly, her hands pushing against the man's broad chest. Her name, Eli would later learn, was Lottie. But in that moment, she was only the embodiment of a horror he had seen before, a nightmare he had failed to stop once already. He did not think, he acted. He moved through the canvas opening in a single, swift motion. The man, startled, began to turn, his mouth opening to shout. He never got the chance. Eli's fist connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud. It was not a brawler's punch. It was a cold, calculated strike meant to end a fight before it began. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed like a sack of grain, taking Lottie down with him. She cried out, a small gasp of shock and fear. Eli pulled the unconscious man off her and grabbed her arm. Her skin was ice cold. Come on, he hissed, his voice low and urgent. Now. She was too stunned to resist. He half dragged, half carried her out of the wagon and back into the deluge. The rain was a solid wall of water, washing away the scene, the sounds, everything but the feel of her trembling body next to his. They slipped and slid through the mud, their breathing ragged, until they were back within the relative sanctuary of the livery stable. He led her to the empty stall where his horse stood, the animal shifting nervously at their sudden entrance. He let go of her arm, and she stumbled back against the wooden partition, wrapping her arms around herself. In the dim light filtering through the hayloft, he could see she was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. Her face was streaked with mud and tears, her dark hair plastered to her skull. Those wide, dark eyes were fixed on him, filled with a new kind of fear now, fear of him. Who are you? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the roof. Doesn't matter, Eli said, his tone rougher than he intended. He was already regretting this. Every second he spent here, his own danger grew. You're safe for now. He turned to leave her there, to go back to the loft and his own troubles. But her voice stopped him. Wait, she begged, and there was a new urgency in her tone. Please, do not take me back there. Do not let them find me. Eli sighed, running a wet hand over his tired face. Look, girl, I just got you out. What happens next is up to you. I'm just passing through. She took a hesitant step toward him, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. He will come for me, Brother Josiah. He will sell me to the next man, or worse. Her voice dropped to a frantic, desperate whisper. He had to lean closer to hear her over the storm. I am still a virgin, she breathed, the words tasting of shame and terror. It is all I have left that is mine. Please, Please do not let them take that, too." The raw, desperate plea struck Eli harder than any fist. It was not about piety or virtue. It was about a young woman pushed to the absolute edge, clinging to the last piece of herself that had not been bartered, claimed, or stolen. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. She was just a girl, probably no more than 17, lost and alone and utterly terrified. And in her eyes, he saw the ghost of another woman, another promise he had failed to keep. The fight went out of him, replaced by a deep, familiar weariness. He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her to run, to find the sheriff, to do anything that did not involve him. But the words would not come. The memory of his past failure held him fast. He could not walk away. Not again. He let out a long, slow breath. "One night," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I can hide you here for one night. In the morning, you're on your own." Relief washed over her face, so potent it was almost painful to watch. She nodded, tears spilling from her eyes and tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Eli just grunted in response. Turning away from her gratitude, he felt no nobility in his decision, only the heavy weight of consequence. He had stopped running from the men behind him only to be caught in a different kind of trap, one set by the pleading eyes of a girl he did not know, and a conscience he thought he had long since buried. He climbed back to the loft, not to sleep, but to watch and to wait, grappling with the question of whether he had just saved a life, or thrown his own away. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively calm. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the gaps in the livery walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Eli had not slept. He had spent the night in the hayloft, a sentinel in the shadows, listening to the rain and the girl's occasional, muffled sob from the stall below. Every sound from the street, every distant shout, had sent a jolt through him. He was a man accustomed to listening for danger, but this was different. He was not just listening for himself anymore. When he climbed down the ladder, he found her awake. She had swept the dirt floor of the stall into a neat pile with a broken piece of board and had tried to tidy her torn dress. She was still pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but the raw terror had receded, replaced by a fragile composure. She flinched when his boots hit the ground, her body tensing, but she did not run. "You should eat something," he said, his voice a low gravel. He held out a piece of jerky and a hard biscuit from his saddlebag. It was not much, but it was all he had. She took it with a quiet, "Thank you," her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. Her hand was as cold as a stone. She ate slowly, deliberately, as if chewing each bite were a conscious act of survival. In the quiet of the morning, with the scent of rain-soaked earth hanging in the air, she began to speak. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was steady. Her name was Lottie Mae Cutler. She was an orphan, raised from the age of 6 in a Christian mission house back in Ohio after her parents succumbed to consumption. It was a life of harsh beds, thin soup, and endless scripture. The matrons were stern, preaching duty and submission as the highest virtues a woman could possess. When Brother Josiah arrived, he seemed like an answer to their prayers. He spoke of the West as a promised land, a place where good, pious women were needed to build strong families, to be the bedrock of new communities. He promised them husbands, homes, a purpose, to a girl who had never had anything of her own. The promise was a powerful lure. "He said we were doing God's work," Lottie whispered, her eyes fixed on the biscuit in her hands. "That we would be cherished." The matrons believed him. They wept when we left, telling us how blessed we were. There were a dozen girls at first. They traveled for weeks in the back of the long wagon, seeing the country change from green hills to flat, endless plains, and finally to this harsh, sun-scalded land. The journey was hard, but it was the nights that were worse. Men would meet with Brother Josiah in towns along the way. Quiet, furtive meetings that ended with a clink of coins and one of the girls being led away, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Lottie learned quickly not to ask questions. The severe-faced woman, Sister Agnes, would punish any girl who spoke out of turn. They were told the girls were being placed with their new families, that they should be joyful. But Lottie never saw joy on any of their faces. She only saw the same hunted look she felt in her own heart. By the time they reached Providence, only 5 girls were left, and she had understood, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were not brides-to-be. They were property. Eli listened without interruption, his face an unreadable mask. He had seen the hardness of the world, but her story, told in that quiet, defeated voice, stirred something in him he had long thought dead. It was the simple, brutal injustice of it, a wolf cloaked in piety, preying on the hopeful and the helpless. "He is not a man of God," she finished, her voice trembling slightly. "He is a merchant, and we are his wares." Her quiet dignity was a strange and powerful thing. She did not weep or rail against her fate. She stated it as a fact, a truth she had been forced to accept. She was naive, yes, to have believed the promises in the first place. But she was not stupid. She saw the world for what it was now, and it was that clear-eyed understanding that affected Eli more than any tears could have. His first instinct, the practical one, was to find the law. A man wearing a star, no matter how tarnished, had a duty. He left Lottie in the loft with strict instructions not to make a sound, and walked across the muddy street to the sheriff's office. The man behind the desk looked like he had been poured into his chair and had sat there for years. He was overweight, with a sweaty face and small, shrewd eyes that took in Eli's worn gun belt and trail-dusted clothes with a single, dismissive glance. His name was Sheriff Miller. Eli kept his story simple. He had overheard a disturbance, saw a man forcing himself on one of the orphan girls from the revival camp. He left his own name out of it, painting himself as a concerned traveler. Miller listened, leaning back in his chair so it groaned in protest, and began cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a letter opener. He did not seem surprised or alarmed. "Brother Josiah is a guest of this town," the sheriff said when Eli had finished, his voice a wheezy drawl. "He brings commerce. People come from all around for his meetings. He's a pillar of the community, you might say." "A pillar who sells girls out of the back of a wagon?" Eli's voice was dangerously low. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Those are serious accusations. Stranger, Brother Josiah assures me he is providing a Christian service. He finds suitable homes for unfortunate orphans. There are legal documents, contracts, all signed and proper." "A contract for a man to buy a girl like she is a horse?" Miller set the letter opener down with a soft click. "Now you listen to me. This town is quiet. We like it quiet. Brother Josiah, he handles his own affairs. What he does with his wards is between him, the good Lord, and the gentlemen who wish to start a family. It is not the business of a drifter passing through. You understand?" The message was clear. The sheriff was not just unwilling to help, he was complicit. He was either being paid for his silence or was too cowardly to challenge a man who had the town's small-minded leadership in his pocket. Eli felt a surge of cold fury. He looked at the tarnished star on Miller's chest and saw nothing but a piece of cheap, empty metal. He turned and walked out without another word, the sheriff's warning to keep on riding following him out the door. The law was not an option. The easy way out was gone. He was on his own, with her. Walking back to the stable, the weight of his situation settled on him. He was a wanted man hiding in a hostile town, now burdened with a runaway girl who had nowhere to go. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He, who could not save himself, was now responsible for saving someone else. The thought sent a jolt of memory through him, sharp and unwelcome as a knife in the ribs. The memory was of a different town, greener than this one, with a woman whose laughter was like the sound of a cool stream. Her name was Clara. He had been the foreman on a sprawling ranch, respected for his way with horses and men, but always an outsider. He was Eli Kerrigan, a man who had appeared one day with no family name to speak of, no history he would share. He had been an orphan himself, raised by a hard-bitten trapper who had taught him to survive but not how to belong. Clara had not cared. She was the town baker's daughter, and she saw the goodness in him that he could not see in himself. She had loved him fiercely, without reservation. They were to be married, but the town whispered. They looked at his calloused hands, his quiet nature, and the gun he wore with such easy familiarity, and they saw a threat. They called him a man with no proper name, a rootless drifter who would only bring her ruin. The whispers turned to shunning. People stopped buying her father's bread. Children threw stones at their window. Clara grew pale and thin, the light in her eyes dimming under the constant pressure of their judgment. He had urged her to leave with him, to ride away and never look back, but she was loyal to her father, to the only home she had ever known. Then the winter sickness came. The doctor, a man who had shared the town's prejudice, was slow to arrive. By the time he did, it was too late. She died in his arms, her last breath a whispered apology for not being strong enough. Eli stopped in the middle of the street, the present-day mud sucking at his boots, but his mind was miles and years away, standing over a fresh grave on a cold, wind-swept hill. The town had not killed her with a gun or a knife, but they had killed her all the same. They had broken her spirit, and he, who had sworn to protect her, had stood by and watched it happen. He had failed her. His guilt was a constant companion, a ghost that rode on his shoulder. He had sworn then that he would never again be responsible for a woman's fate. He did not deserve a second chance to fail. When he returned to the stable, Lottie was waiting, her face etched with anxiety. She saw the answer to her unspoken question in his grim expression. "He will not help," she stated. It was not a question. "He will not," Eli confirmed. "He is one of them." A flicker of despair crossed her face, but she quickly suppressed it. She straightened her shoulders. "Then I cannot be a burden to you. You have done enough. I will not bring you trouble." "It is too late for that," he said gruffly. "Trouble's already here." He looked at her, at the quiet resolve hardening her features. "You cannot just walk out of here. They will be looking for you. For both of us. Now." For the rest of the day, they existed in the shadows of the livery. Henderson, the owner, was paid for his silence with one of Eli's few silver dollars, a price that ensured he would see nothing and say nothing. In return for the shelter, Lottie insisted on working. She mucked out stalls, filled water troughs, and brushed down Eli's horse with gentle, steady strokes. There was a quiet competence in her movements, a refusal to be idle, to be a victim. Eli watched her, a reluctant admiration growing within him. She worked until her hands were raw and her face was smudged with dirt, but she did not complain. As the afternoon wore on, the weather began to turn again. The sky grew hazy, taking on a sickly yellow tint. The wind picked up, not with the promise of rain this time, but with a dry, menacing howl. It whipped sand and grit against the walls of the stable, a relentless, scraping sound that set Eli's teeth on edge. A dust storm was coming. It was Lottie who broke the tense silence. "That man last night," she said, her back to him as she braided Dust's tail. "The way you stopped him? Have you done that before?" Eli thought of a dozen brawls in smoky saloons, of range disputes settled with fists, of the grim necessity of survival in a lawless land. "I have," was all he said. She turned to face him, her expression serious. "Will you teach me how to stop someone like that?" Eli looked at her small, slender frame. She was all sharp angles and fragile bones. "The best way to stop a man like that is to not be there when he comes around." "But sometimes you cannot run," she countered, her voice gaining a new strength. "Sometimes there is nowhere left to run." She held his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not fear, but a burning resolve. "I do not want to be helpless. I do not want to feel that way ever again." He hesitated for a long moment. Putting a gun in her hand felt like a line being crossed, an admission that he was in this deeper than he ever intended. But looking at her, he knew she was right. In this world, running was not always enough. He unholstered his Colt, the heavy blue-black steel seeming monstrously large in the fading light. He checked that it was unloaded before holding it out to her. Handle first. "It is not a toy. It is heavy, and it kicks like a mule." She took it with both hands, her arms trembling slightly from the unexpected weight. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace her arm, how to line up the sights. His hands covered hers for a moment, guiding her grip, and he felt a tremor run through her. He pulled back as if burned. He set up an old bottle on a fence post at the back of the livery, the wind threatening to tear it from its perch. He gave her a single cartridge. "The noise will be loud," he warned. "Louder than you can imagine. Do not close your eyes. Squeeze the trigger. Do not jerk it." Lottie stood for a long time, the gun held out before her, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She took a deep breath, the way he had shown her. The storm was rising, the air growing thick and suffocating with dust, and in that maelstrom of wind and grit, she stood her ground. The explosion, when it came, was deafening in the enclosed space. The gun bucked in her hands, but she held on. The bottle on the fence post remained untouched, but that did not matter. A look of fierce, startled triumph flashed across her face. She had done it. She had faced the noise and the power and had not flinched. The wind howled, drowning out all other sound. She lowered the pistol, her arms shaking from the effort, and looked at him. Through the swirling dust, their eyes met. "You saved me," she said, her voice soft but clear over the wind's shriek. "But I do not want to feel broken. Not anymore." That night, the dust storm raged, sealing them in the stable as if they were the last two people on earth. The world outside was a howling, blinding chaos of sand and fury. Henderson had gone home, leaving them in the flickering light of a single lantern. Eli built a small, contained fire in an old metal bucket, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. They sat near it, close enough to feel its warmth, but not touching. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. He could still feel the phantom warmth of her hands under his, and she could still feel the thunder of the gunshot echoing in her bones. They were two strangers, thrown together by violence and circumstance, stripped bare of all pretense by the storm raging both outside and within them. They were emotionally unraveling in the quiet dark, finding a strange and fragile comfort in simply sharing the same small circle of light. The dust storm blew itself out by morning, leaving a fine layer of grit on every surface, a reddish-brown powder that coated the world in a film of weary resignation. The air was still and heavy, thick with the taste of sand. Inside the livery, the silence was more unnerving than the storm's howl had been. Every creak of the building, every nervous snort from a horse, sounded like a gunshot in the tense quiet. The news came with Henderson, the stable owner. He scurried in near midday, his face pale and his hands twisting the life out of a dirty rag. He avoided looking at the ladder to the loft, where Lottie was hidden, as if the very act of looking up would betray her presence. "They know," he whispered, his voice a frantic rasp. He directed his words to Eli, but his eyes darted everywhere at once. Brother Josiah and that woman of his, they were up at the sheriff's office at sunrise, screaming about a stolen lamb from their flock, a girl led astray by a sinful drifter. Eli's jaw tightened. He had expected this, but the reality of it was a cold weight in his gut. "Did they use my name?" "No," Henderson admitted, shaking his head so vigorously that dust flew from his hair. "Just a description. Tall, dark hair, wearing a gray duster. Could be half the men passing through this territory. But they are not leaving it to the sheriff. Brother Josiah's put up money, a reward for the girl's return. No questions asked for the man who brings her back safe and sound. Bounty hunters. The word hung in the air, sour and ugly. It turned a rescue into a kidnapping, a desperate flight into a criminal act. It painted Lottie as property and him as a thief. "You have to go," Henderson pleaded, his fear palpable. "Both of you, before they start searching the town proper. My wife, she's terrified. If they find you here." He did not need to finish the sentence. Eli gave a curt nod. "We will be gone by nightfall." Henderson looked relieved, but a new shadow of fear crossed his face. "There is more. Another man wrote in this morning, asking questions, not about a girl, about you, Kerrigan." Eli went still, a cold stillness that was more menacing than any sudden movement. "What did he look like?" "Dressed well," Henderson said, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Black coat, clean-shaven, a silver-handled pistol worn high on his hip. He has cold eyes, like a snake's. Said his name was Vickers." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Clayton Vickers, a man who hunted men for a living and who did it with a cruel, methodical patience. They had been rivals once, years ago, when Eli had briefly and unhappily ridden as a regulator for a cattlemen's association. They had tracked the same rustler, and Eli had brought him in alive, while Vickers had argued for a rope over the nearest tree. The dispute had ended with Vickers on his back in the dust, nursing a split lip and a bruised ego. Vickers was not a man who forgot such a slight. He carried his grudges like prized possessions. If he was here, it was not a coincidence. The rancher with the son who had a broken jaw must have hired the best. "He knows I am here?" Eli asked, his voice flat. "He suspects. He was asking about a man on a dun gelding. He's over at the saloon now, watching the street, waiting." Eli's world, which had already shrunk to the four walls of a livery stable, now seemed to constrict to the size of a coffin. Vickers on one side, Brother Josiah's hired guns on the other, and a town full of fearful, tight-lipped people in between. There was no way out, not an easy one. He climbed the ladder to the hayloft. Lottie was huddled in the far corner, her knees drawn up to her chest. She had heard everything. Her face was a stark white mask of terror, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. The fragile composure she had built over the last day had been shattered. "I will go," she said, her voice a choked whisper before he could even speak. "I will go back to them. You can tell them you found me, that you were bringing me back. They will give you the reward, and you can ride away. Vickers will have no reason to trouble you." Eli looked at her, at this girl who was willing to walk back into her own nightmare to save him, a stranger who had shown her a moment's kindness. The thought of it, of handing her over to those pious frauds, sent a wave of revulsion through him. It was the same choice he had faced before, in a different way. Stand by and watch, or act and pay the price. He shook his head, the movement sharp and decisive. "No." "But they will kill you," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "Because of me. I cannot have that on my soul." He walked over and crouched down in front of her, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Listen to me. I have done worse for less noble reasons," he said, the words tasting like old ash in his mouth. He thought of the men he had hurt, the lives he had disrupted, all for pay or for pride. This was different. "I will not hand over someone begging to stay human. We will find a way out of this. Together." His resolve seemed to flow into her, calming her trembling. But as one fear receded, another took its place, one that came from deeper inside. She looked down at her hands, her voice dropping so low he could barely hear it. "Even if we do," she whispered, "what then? What becomes of me?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a profound and heartbreaking shame. "That man in the wagon, he did not succeed, but he touched me. His hands were on me. I feel dirty, soiled, like a dress that has been stained, even if the stain did not set. She took a shuddering breath. Brother Josiah paraded us like prized fillies, speaking of our purity. But I do not feel pure. What man would want me now, knowing what was almost done to me? Who would ever look at me and not see the grime? The rawness of her confession silenced him. It was a wound no medicine could heal, a fear no gun could fight off. He had saved her from a physical act, but he could not save her from the shame that had been branded onto her spirit. It was the ghost of what might have been, a shadow that would follow her long after the bruises faded. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching her chin, lifting her face so she had to look at him. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Anyone worth a damn would see you," he said, his voice softer than he had intended. "Not the grime." But even as he said the words, a deep, weary fatalism settled over him. He knew how the world worked. He knew the value placed on a woman's reputation, how easily it could be destroyed by whispers and lies. He had seen it happen to Clara. He had rescued Lottie from the cage. But the world outside was just a larger prison, with different bars. He let his hand drop, a sigh escaping his lips. He turned away, looking out through a crack in the wall at the hostile town below. "You cannot save a virgin twice," he muttered, the words more to himself than to her. A quiet acknowledgement of a bitter truth. He could not give her back the innocence that had been stolen, not the physical part, but the part that lived in the heart, the part that allowed a person to feel clean and whole. That was a battle she would have to fight on her own. They spent the rest of the day in near silence, the tension stretching tighter with every passing hour. Eli watched the street from his vantage point. He saw Vickers leave the saloon and walk the length of the town, slow and deliberate, his eyes missing nothing. He saw men who did not look like townsfolk, hard men with guns on their hips, speaking in low tones with Brother Josiah. The trap was being set. Their only chance was to run, to slip out under the cover of darkness and ride hard for the broken canyon lands to the east. It was rough country, but a man could disappear there if he was lucky. When night fell, it brought no relief, only a deeper darkness that seemed to be filled with unseen threats. A sliver of moon offered little light. The wind had died down, and the silence was absolute. Eli went over the plan with Lottie in hushed whispers. He would saddle the horses in their stalls to muffle the sound. They would lead them out the back of the livery, through a gate that opened onto a narrow alley. From there, it was a straight shot to the edge of town. "Stay close to me," he said, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "No matter what happens, do not stop. Just run." She nodded, her eyes wide, but her jaw set with determination. She was terrified, but she was not the trembling girl he had first seen. There was a core of steel in her now, forged in fear and tempered by resolve. He moved with practiced stealth, saddling his horse, Dust, and the gentle mare Lottie had been tending to. The soft thud of the blankets and the creak of the leather cinches sounded like thunderclaps in the silence. He held his breath, listening. There was nothing. He gave Lottie the reins to the mare and took his own, placing a hand on her shoulder to signal for her to follow. They led the horses through the dark, cavernous space of the livery, their footsteps silent in the soft dirt. The back gate was stiff, its hinges groaning in protest as Eli carefully eased it open. The alley was a narrow channel of blackness between two buildings. Freedom was 100 yards away. They had made it halfway down the alley when a voice cut through the darkness, smooth and cold as polished steel. "Leaving so soon, Kerrigan? I was just starting to enjoy the local hospitality." "Vickers." He stepped out from the deeper shadow of a doorway, a dark silhouette against the faint light of the street beyond. He was not alone. Two other men, the hard-faced types Eli had seen earlier, emerged from the shadows behind him, blocking their path. Eli pushed Lottie behind him, his body shielding hers. "Vickers," he said, his voice calm and even. "I am just passing through. I have no business with you." A humorless smile touched Vickers's lips. "I think you do. You see, a mutual friend of ours, a wealthy rancher, is very concerned about your well-being. And another new acquaintance, a man of the cloth, is missing one of his flock." He took a step closer, his cold eyes flicking to Lottie, who shrank back behind Eli. "It seems your business has become my business, and business is good." "The girl is not part of this," Eli said, his hand hovering over his gun. "Let her go, and you and I can settle our affairs." Vickers chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "I am afraid she is the most valuable part. The reward for her is quite substantial. The one for you is just a bonus." He gestured with his chin. "Give her to my men. We will see she gets back to Brother Josiah, safe and sound. Then you and I can talk." Eli knew it was a lie. The moment they had Lottie, he would be a dead man. "That is not going to happen." "I was afraid you would say that," Vickers said, his smile vanishing. Everything happened at once. Vickers' hand dropped to his silver-handled pistol. Eli shoved Lottie toward the horses, shouting, "Run!" as he drew his own weapon. The alley exploded in a chaos of noise and muzzle flashes. A gunshot boomed, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Eli felt a white-hot poker sear across his side, stealing his breath and sending him stumbling back against the wall. He fired back, his shot going wide as pain clouded his vision. One of Vickers's men lunged for Lottie, grabbing the reins of her horse. She screamed, a sound of pure terror. The man grinned, his teeth a yellow slash in the dark, and started to drag her toward him. Then came a second explosion, flatter and sharper than the first. The man holding Lottie's reins grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face. He let go of the horse and staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed to the ground without another sound. Eli, clutching his bleeding side, looked over in stunned disbelief. Lottie was standing there, the heavy Colt held out in front of her with both hands, smoke curling from its barrel. Her face was a ghostly white, her eyes wide with shock and horror at what she had just done. She had saved him. She had saved herself. Vickers, momentarily stunned by the unexpected turn of events, cursed and fired again. The bullet splintered the wood of the wall next to Eli's head. The second hired gun took aim at Lottie. There was no more time for thought. Eli launched himself forward, ignoring the fire in his side, and tackled the remaining gunmen, sending them both crashing into a pile of empty barrels. He brought the barrel of his own gun down hard on the man's head, and he went limp. "Go!" Eli roared at Lottie. Scrambling to his feet, he grabbed the reins of his horse and swung himself into the saddle, a wave of dizziness and nausea washing over him. Blood was soaking through his shirt, warm and slick against his skin. Lottie was frozen for a second, staring at the man she had shot, before Eli's voice broke through her shock. She mounted her mare, her movements clumsy with panic. Vickers was back on his feet, raising his pistol for another shot. Eli spurred his horse, charging directly at him. Vickers jumped out of the way as dust thundered past, and Eli fired a shot into the dirt near his feet, giving them the precious seconds they needed. They galloped out of the alley and onto the main street, their horses' hooves pounding a frantic rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Shouts erupted behind them as the town came alive. A light flickered on in the sheriff's office. They did not look back. They rode hard, leaning low over their horses' necks, and fled Providence, plunging into the vast, dark wilderness. Behind them, the first rumble of thunder echoed across the plains, and a flash of lightning illuminated the jagged peaks of the canyons ahead, promising a new storm. They were running again, not from rumor and suspicion, but from the reality of blood and gunpowder, riding headlong into the violent heart of the night. The world dissolved into a frantic, jarring rhythm of pounding hooves and tearing wind. Lottie clung to the reins of her mare, her knuckles white, her body numb with a cold that had nothing to do with the rain. The storm had broken with a vengeance, the thunder a constant, rolling cannonade that shook the very ground beneath them. Lightning split the sky, and in those brief, blinding flashes of white, she saw the hellish landscape they were fleeing into, a barren, rock-strewn plain, clawed and scarred by erosion, with the dark, jagged teeth of the canyons looming ahead. Beside her, Eli was a slumping shadow in the saddle. He rode with his head down, one hand pressed tight against his side, his body swaying with every stride of his horse. In the stark glare of a lightning strike, she saw his face, pale as bone and slick with rain, his teeth gritted against a pain she could only imagine. He was leading them, but his guidance was becoming erratic, his horse sensing the faltering hand on its reins. Fear, sharp and acidic, cut through the shock that had encased her since she had pulled the trigger. The image of the man falling, his face a mask of surprise, was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. She could still feel the violent buck of the gun in her hands, still smell the acrid scent of gunpowder on the rain-washed air. She had taken a life. The thought was a monstrous, indigestible thing in her soul. But then she would look at Eli, at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, and a different, more powerful instinct took over. Survival. He had been shot protecting her. She would not let him die out here. "Which way?" she screamed over the howl of the wind, urging her horse closer to his. He lifted his head, and it seemed to take all the strength he had left. He pointed a trembling hand toward a dark cleft in the canyon wall, visible only when the lightning flashed. "In there. Find shelter." His voice was a ragged whisper, swallowed by the storm. He slumped forward again, and a moment later, he would have fallen from the saddle had she not surged ahead. Grabbing the reins of his horse, Dust, the weary dun gelding, slowed to a halt, its sides heaving. Eli was barely conscious. "No," Lottie whispered, her voice fierce. "You will not. Not now." She dismounted, her legs unsteady in the slick mud. Taking the reins of both horses in one hand, she began to walk, leading them toward the dark maw of the canyon. She was no longer the frightened girl from the preacher's wagon. She was a woman leading a wounded man through a tempest, guided by nothing but flashes of lightning and a desperate, stubborn will to live. The canyon offered some respite from the wind, its high walls funneling the storm's roar into a mournful moan. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose rock and tangled brush that tore at her dress. Every few steps, she would stop and look back at Eli, making sure he was still in the saddle. He was a dead weight, a passenger at the mercy of her strength. They stumbled on for what felt like hours. The rain lessened to a steady, miserable drizzle. The lightning moved farther away, its flashes less frequent, plunging them into longer and longer stretches of near total darkness. She was about to give in to despair, to believe they would simply wander in this rocky maze until they collapsed, when she smelled it, faint but unmistakable on the damp air, the scent of old smoke and abandonment. During the next flash of lightning, she saw it, tucked into an overhang on the canyon wall, almost invisible against the dark rock, was a small, dark rectangle, a door, a deserted cabin, likely belonging to a trapper or a prospector who had long since moved on or died. It was a miracle. Getting Eli off the horse was an ordeal. He was limp and unresponsive, his body burning with fever. He groaned as his feet hit the ground, his weight collapsing against her. She half dragged, half carried him through the rickety door and into the single dark room. The cabin was small and squalid, but it was dry. It contained a crude stone fireplace, a broken table, and a raised wooden platform covered with a moth-eaten blanket that served as a bed. Lottie eased Eli onto the platform, his head lolling to one side. In the gloom, she could hear his breathing, shallow and ragged. She worked quickly, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She found a rusty bucket and filled it from a stream that trickled nearby. She tore a long strip from the hem of her already ruined dress to use as a bandage. When she gently pulled his blood-soaked shirt away from the wound, she had to stifle a gasp. The bullet had grazed his side, tearing a deep, ugly furrow through skin and muscle. It was bleeding sluggishly, the area around it already swollen and red. It was not a fatal wound, not if she could keep the fever from taking him. For the next 3 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of that dusty, forgotten cabin. Time blurred into a cycle of repetitive, desperate tasks. She kept a small, smoky fire going in the hearth. She bathed his wound with cool water, her hands trembling as she did so, a phantom recoil from the butt of the gun still echoing in her nerves. She dribbled water between his cracked lips. When he shivered uncontrollably, she covered him with her own body, trying to lend him her warmth, her life. He was lost in the fevered grip of delirium. He tossed and turned, muttering words she could not understand, his eyes seeing things that were not there. Sometimes he would cry out, a sharp, anguished sound that twisted her heart, and he would whisper a name, over and over, a ghostly rasp in the quiet of the cabin. Clara! During the long, silent hours, with nothing but the sound of his breathing and the crackle of the fire, Lottie was left alone with her thoughts. The face of the man she had shot was a constant presence, his surprised expression a permanent fixture in her mind. She had not meant to kill him. She had only meant to stop him, but the result was the same. A man was dead by her hand. She felt a profound sense of horror, but strangely, no guilt. It was him or her, him or Eli. She had chosen. The girl who had been raised to believe that meekness was a virtue had discovered a core of hard, unyielding survival within herself. But the discovery did not bring her peace. It only made her feel more alone, more alien, as if she no longer belonged to the world she had once known. On the 3rd night, the fever reached its peak. Eli's skin was scorching to the touch, his breathing so shallow she had to lean close to see the rise and fall of his chest. The rain had returned, a gentle, persistent drumming on the roof that seemed to measure out the passing seconds of his life. Lottie sat beside him, bathing his face with a damp cloth, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She believed he was dying. Sometime in the darkest hour before dawn, his eyes opened. They were lucid for the first time in days, but they were filled with a deep, bottomless despair. He looked at her, but she was not sure he truly saw her. He seemed to be looking through her, into the past. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thin and dry as dust. Lottie's hand stilled. She said nothing, her heart aching for this ghost, this woman whose name he called on what he thought was his deathbed. "I failed you," he breathed, the words a confession torn from the depths of his soul. I should have taken you away." He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his temple. "The town," they whispered, "hated you for loving me. A man with no name, no proper name." His voice broke. "I watched them break you, day by day. I watched the light go out of your eyes. And I did nothing. I stood by and did nothing. I was a coward." He fell silent, his confession hanging in the air, raw and bleeding. Lottie finally understood. She understood the wall he kept around himself, the haunted look in his eyes, the reluctance to get involved. He was a man living in the shadow of a failure so profound he believed it had defined him forever. He was not just running from Vickers. He was running from the ghost of the man he thought he should have been. Overwhelmed by a wave of emotion she could not name, pity, tenderness, a fierce desire to erase the pain from his face, she leaned down. Her dark hair fell around them like a curtain, shutting out the rest of the world. She pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, as gentle as the rain on the roof. A kiss meant to soothe, to comfort, to offer a moment of grace in the face of death. She pulled back and whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "You did not fail me. You saved me twice already." For a moment, he seemed to be looking at her, at Lottie, and not at the ghost of Clara. A flicker of confusion, of surprise, crossed his features. Then, with a strength that startled her, He pushed her away. The movement was not violent, but it was firm, absolute. "No," he rasped, turning his face to the wall. "I am not who you think I am. I bring ruin." The words were filled with a shame so deep it was a physical presence in the small cabin. He was rejecting not just her kiss, but her forgiveness. He did not believe he deserved it. Hurt and confused, Lottie drew back, wrapping her arms around herself. The rejection was a cold slap, pushing her back into her own lonely corner of grief and shock. The space between them, which had been bridged for a single, fragile moment, was now a chasm wider than the canyon outside. The rain began to fall harder, the gentle drumming turning into a steady downpour. The sound seemed to fill the cabin, amplifying the silence between them. After a long while, Eli struggled to sit up, his body trembling with the effort. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and, using the wall for support, staggered to his feet. He moved like an old man, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and stumbled toward the door. He pushed it open and walked out into the pouring rain. Lottie watched him go, her heart pounding. He stood in the deluge, his head thrown back, letting the cold, clean water wash over his face, his fevered body. It was an act of penance, or perhaps of surrender. She could have stayed inside, in the dry warmth of the cabin. She could have respected the wall he had thrown back up between them, but she looked at his solitary figure, a man trying to drown his own ghosts in a storm, and she knew she could not leave him out there alone. She stood up and walked to the door. She stepped out into the rain, the cold shock of it taking her breath away. Her thin dress was soaked in an instant, clinging to her skin. The water plastered her hair to her face. She walked over to him until she was standing directly in front of him, so close she could feel the heat still radiating from his body. The rain fell on them both, washing away the grime, the blood, the tears. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the gloom. The shame was still there, but so was something else, something raw and vulnerable. "Then show me who you are," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, a challenge and a plea all in one. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, the rain streaming down their faces, dripping from his chin, from her eyelashes. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. There was nothing gentle about it this time. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, born of fever and grief and a longing so profound it was painful. It was the kiss of two people who had been pushed to the edge of the world and had found each other there. It tasted of rain and sorrow and the faintest, most fragile glimmer of hope. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. And she kissed him back with all the pent-up fear and gratitude and burgeoning life that was inside her. In the heart of the storm, under the open, weeping sky, they clung to each other, two broken souls finding a desperate, beautiful, and terrifying sanctuary. The fever broke with the dawn. The rain-soaked world outside the cabin was hushed, dripping, and intensely green. Eli awoke to a profound stillness, both in the air and within himself. The fire in his veins had been replaced by a deep, aching weakness, but his mind was clear for the first time in days. He was lying on the crude bed, a damp cloth on his forehead. Lottie was asleep in a chair near the dead fireplace, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her face pale and exhausted in the gray morning light. Memory returned not in a flood, but in fragments. The alley, the searing pain, the storm, his fevered confession, and the desperate, rain-soaked kiss. A hot flush of shame washed over him, more potent than the fever had been. He had burdened her not only with his wound, but with the wreckage of his past. He had taken advantage of her sympathy, of her presence in a moment of profound weakness. He sat up slowly, his sides screaming in protest. The movement woke her. Her eyes flew open, wide and startled for a moment, before they focused on him. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful concern. "Your fever is gone," she said, her voice soft. "Thanks to you," he replied, his own voice raspy. He looked at his side. The wound was clean, the bandage expertly tied. "You have a knack for this." "The matrons at the mission house made us tend to the sick," she said simply, rising to stir the embers in the fireplace and add a few pieces of damp wood. "It was our duty." An uncomfortable silence settled between them, thick with the memory of the night before. Eli had to break it. "Lottie," he began, and the sound of her name on his lips felt both strange and intimate. "About last night, what I said, and what happened out there in the rain. I was not in my right mind. I had no right." She turned from the fire to face him, her expression unreadable. "Were you not telling the truth?" "It was the truth," he admitted, looking down at his hands. "But it was not yours to carry." "And the kiss?" she asked, her voice steady. "Was that not the truth either?" He looked up, meeting her direct gaze. He could not lie to her. "It was." "Then you have nothing to apologize for," she said. She walked over to the edge of the bed and sat, not close enough to touch, but close enough to speak without raising her voice. "You shared your hurt with me. I chose to share mine with you. I do not regret it." Her simple, honest words disarmed him. He had expected tears or accusations, or, worse, a fearful silence. Instead, she offered him a quiet, unadorned acceptance that he felt he had done nothing to deserve. "We need to talk about what happens now," he said, shifting the subject to safer, more practical ground. "Once I can ride, we head west, toward the Arizona territory. It is rough country, but a person can disappear there. Start over." "Start over," she repeated the words softly, as if testing their weight. "As what? A runaway girl you saved? Your woman?" The question hung in the air. The unspoken implications of their kiss, of their forced intimacy, had been laid bare. He saw the fragile thread between desire and consent, between rescue and obligation, and he knew he had to tread carefully. "As whatever you choose to be," he said, his voice earnest. "I will not put a claim on you, Lottie. Not after what you have been through. You get to make your own choices from now on. I will take you wherever you need to go to be safe. And then I will be on my way." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie, for the hidden price, finding none. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A flicker of something new appeared in her eyes, a spark of resolve that he had not seen before. "I want to choose," she said, the words coming out stronger than she might have intended. "All my life, choices have been made for me. What to wear, what to eat, what to believe. Brother Josiah chose a future for me that I did not want. You chose to save me, and I'm grateful for it. But now," she took a deep breath, "the man in the alley, I chose to fire that gun. I chose to save you, to save myself. And last night, in the rain, I chose to kiss you." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "I am not the same girl who left that wagon. I do not feel dirty anymore. Or broken?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I just feel new, and I want to be the one who decides what happens to me next, who I give myself to, how, and why." Eli was silent, humbled by her strength. The quiet, trembling girl was gone, and in her place was a woman forged in terror and tempered by her own will. He was no longer her savior. He was simply a man privileged to be in her presence. Back in Providence, Clayton Vickers was very much alive. He sat in the sheriff's office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, while the town doctor finished stitching the gash on his forearm where one of Eli's bullets had grazed him. He had survived the ambush with little more than a wounded arm and a deeply wounded pride. The man Lottie had shot was dead, and the other hired gun had a concussion and a broken nose. It had been a humiliating failure, but Vickers was a master at turning failure into opportunity. "He is a devil, that one," Vickers said. his voice carrying through the open office door to the small crowd of anxious townsfolk gathered outside. Kerrigan. I have been tracking him for weeks. A known killer, a thief, and now he has stooped to this. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably behind his desk. Now, Vickers, we do not know for certain what happened. Vickers slammed his glass down on the desk, making the sheriff jump. We do not? A good man is dead, and that poor innocent girl is gone, dragged off into the wilderness by that animal. He lowered his voice, letting it fill with a tone of righteous sorrow. I saw her face, the terror in her eyes. He had her bewitched, corrupted. Heaven only knows what unspeakable things he has done to her by now. He was playing his audience like a fiddle. He saw the fear and outrage on their faces. These were simple, God-fearing people. The thought of a young orphan girl, a supposed bride-to-be, being kidnapped and violated by a nameless drifter was the stuff of their worst nightmares. It was a story that affirmed all their prejudices about outsiders. Brother Josiah stepped forward, his face a mask of pious grief. She was a lamb, a pure and gentle soul. We were to find her a good Christian home, and now, he let his voice break, covering his face with his hands. Her virtue, her very soul, is in peril. The word virtue hung in the air, a potent and explosive symbol. It was the catalyst. A low murmur went through the crowd, a sound of growing anger. He took her virtue, one man shouted. We have to get her back, another yelled. Vickers raised a hand for silence, a grim, determined look on his face. The sheriff is a good man, but he is only one man. He cannot do this alone. This is not about the law anymore. This is about decency. This is about protecting the innocent. He looked from face to face, his cold eyes igniting their fear. I am riding after them. I will not rest until that poor girl is safe and Kerrigan is either in chains or in the ground. Who will ride with me? A dozen men surged forward, their face set with grim purpose. They were farmers, blacksmiths, store owners, ordinary men now fueled by a potent cocktail of fear, lies, and moral panic. They were no longer a crowd. They were a posse. Sheriff Miller watched them go, his face pale and sweaty, making no move to stop them. He was a man who had long ago chosen the path of least resistance, and that path was now leading to bloodshed. 2 days later, Eli was strong enough to ride. His side was a constant, throbbing ache, but he could sit a horse. They left the sanctuary of the canyon and headed west, toward the jagged line of mountains that marked the border of the Arizona territory. The land was vast and empty, a panorama of scrub brush, sun-baked earth, and a sky so wide and blue it hurt to look at. They rode in a comfortable silence, a new kind of intimacy having grown between them. It was a bond forged not just in shared danger, but in the shared truths they had spoken in the cabin. He found himself watching her, the way she sat her horse with a natural grace, the way she scanned the horizon with a steady, watchful gaze. She was no longer a passenger in her own life. They made camp that night under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. As they sat by the fire, he found himself telling her about Clara, not in a fevered rush of guilt, but in quiet, measured tones. He spoke of her laughter, of her kindness, and of his own failure to protect her from a town's quiet cruelty. You did not fail her, Lottie said, her voice soft in the darkness. You loved her, sometimes. That is all a person can do. Her simple absolution was a balm on a wound he had carried for years. He felt a loosening in his chest, a sense of a burden being shared, if not completely lifted. On their 4th day of travel, they came upon the ghost town. It was a scar on the landscape, the skeletal remains of a mining camp that had gone bust. Blackened timbers and collapsed shanties huddled around a gaping hole in the earth, the mine shaft. A sign, bleached by the sun and hanging by a single nail, read Prosperity. The irony was as bitter as the alkaline dust that coated everything. They were riding down what had once been the main street when Lottie suddenly reined in her horse. Her face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the dark doorway of what had been a saloon. Eli followed her gaze. Two women were sitting on the warped threshold, their dresses little more than stained rags, their faces old before their time. Their eyes were hollow, empty, all the light having been scoured out of them by a life of hard use and abandonment. They stared at Lottie and Eli with a dull, listless curiosity, like cattle watching a passing train. They were the human wreckage of the boom and bust, girls who had likely been brought here with promises of a better life, only to be used up and discarded when the silver ran out. Lottie could not look away. In their empty faces, she saw a terrifying reflection. She saw the girl she had been, the girl she had almost become. She saw the end of the road for women who were treated as property, to be bought and sold and ultimately thrown away. These were the other lambs from other flocks, the ones no one had come to save. A wave of nausea and a cold, terrible clarity washed over her. Arizona was not the answer. Disappearing was not a victory. Their escape was personal, temporary, but the machine that had created these broken women, the machine that Brother Josiah and men like him operated, would keep on grinding. She turned her horse to face Eli, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. It was not anger or fear. It was a cold, hard certainty. "We cannot," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "We cannot run anymore." Eli looked from her to the women in the doorway, and he understood. "Lottie, there is nothing for us back there but a rope for me, and worse for you. Vickers has a posse." "I do not care," she said, and he knew she meant it. "If we run, they will do it again. They will find another mission house, another group of hopeful, scared girls. They will sell them and hurt them and discard them just like them." She gestured toward the saloon. "Our running away will not stop it. It will only make it easier for them. No one will know the truth. It will be just another story of a wicked man and a fallen girl." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent years running, telling himself it was the smart thing to do, the only way to survive. But Lottie, who had every reason in the world to run, was choosing to stand. She was not asking for revenge. She was asking for justice. He looked at her, at this impossible, courageous woman, and he saw the ghost of Clara, not as a symbol of his failure, but as a question he had never answered. What was the point of survival if it meant turning your back while the world burned? He had failed to save one woman he loved. He would not fail another by forcing her to become someone she was not, a woman who ran from a fight that was righteous and true. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a decision being made, of a lifetime of habit being broken. He reached out and took the reins of her horse, turning it back the way they had come. He gave her a small, grim smile. "All right, Lottie Mae Cutler," he said. "Let us go back and show them the truth." The journey back to Providence was a quiet pilgrimage. They rode not with the frantic desperation of escape, but with the heavy, solemn purpose of two soldiers marching toward a battle they knew they might not survive. The sky ahead was a turbulent sea of gray and bruised purple, the same color it had been the day Eli first arrived. A cold wind swept down from the plains, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of a reckoning. They did not speak of what they would do, or what might happen. They had made their choice in the shadow of the ghost town, and now there was nothing left but to see it through. They reached the outskirts of town as dusk began to bleed into the afternoon sky. The wind was whipping dust and stray leaves down the single, empty street. But the town was not deserted. From the far end, near the revival tent, came the sound of a man's booming voice, amplified by righteous fury. A crowd was gathered, larger than before, their dark shapes huddled together against the rising wind. Brother Josiah was holding court. Eli and Lottie dismounted at the livery, leaving their horses in the care of a startled and terrified Henderson, who begged them to ride on. "They will kill you both," the stableman hissed, his eyes wide with fear. Vickers has the whole town spinning with his lies." "The truth needs a voice." "Henderson," Eli said quietly, checking the loads in his Colt. "We are just here to provide it." He looked at Lottie. She was trembling, a fine, barely perceptible shiver that ran through her entire body. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fixed on the revival tent, her jaw set. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You do not have to do this," he said, his voice low. "It is not too late to turn back." She met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not fear, but a profound and sorrowful resolve. "If I turn back now," she said, her voice clear despite the tremble, "I will be running for the rest of my life." She turned and began to walk toward the crowd. Eli fell into step a few paces behind her, his hand resting near the butt of his gun, a silent guardian to her incredible courage. As they drew closer, Brother Josiah's words became clear. He was standing on his makeshift stage, his arms raised to the heavens, his voice thundering with condemnation. "And the serpent came to our flock in the guise of a man," he roared. "A drifter, a soulless vagabond who laid his hands upon a Lamb of God. He stole her from our protection, defiled her innocence, and dragged her into the wilderness to sate his own profane lusts. We ride to bring her back from the clutches of this devil, to cleanse her of his sin, to save her very soul from damnation." The crowd murmured its assent, a low growl of righteous anger. Vickers stood near the stage, his arm in a sling, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He was the wounded hero, the righteous avenger. It was into this cauldron of manufactured fury that Lottie walked. She did not shout or run. She simply walked, step by deliberate step, through the parted crowd. People turned, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and hostility. They saw her torn dress, her trail-worn appearance, and Vickers' lies seemed to be confirmed right before their eyes. She stopped at the foot of the stage, forcing Brother Josiah to trail off into a stunned silence. She stood alone in the small clearing, a single, fragile figure against a tide of judgment. Eli stopped at the edge of the crowd, his presence a silent warning. Lottie took a deep breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She lifted her head and began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried on the wind with the simple, undeniable weight of truth. "My name is Lottie Mae Cutler," she began, her voice shaking but resolute. "I was an orphan from the mission house in Dayton, Ohio. This man," she pointed a trembling finger at Brother Josiah, "came to us and promised us homes. He promised us kind, Christian husbands. He spoke the word of God, and we believed him." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This was not the story they had been told. "But they were lies," Lottie continued, her voice gaining strength. "He did not bring us west to be wives. He brought us here to be sold. I watched as my friends, the other girls who traveled with me, were bartered away in towns just like this one, given to men who paid Brother Josiah in coin for what he called a pious contract." Brother Josiah found his voice. "Lies! The girl is bewitched! She speaks with the tongue of the serpent who corrupted her!" Lottie ignored him, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd, pleading with them to listen. "The night we arrived in this town, he sold me to a man who had been drinking, a man who did not care that I wept, that I begged, a man who believed he had bought the right to own my body." Her voice broke on a sob, but she quickly mastered it. "He tore my dress. He put his hands on me. He tried to take the one thing I had left that was my own." The crowd was dead silent now, all eyes fixed on her. Some of the women in the audience had tears in their eyes, their faces etched with a dawning horror and recognition. "This man," she turned and looked directly at Eli, her voice softening. "This man you call a devil. He heard me crying. He came to the wagon. He stopped it from happening. He asked for nothing in return. He fought for me when no one else would. He protected me when your sheriff turned his back. He taught me that my life was my own, that I had a right to choose." She looked back at the stunned faces of the townsfolk, He did not kidnap me. He rescued me. He did not defile me. He saved me. Everything Brother Josiah and Mr. Vickers have told you is a lie, designed to cover their own wicked trade." The crowd was a sea of shifting emotions. Some faces were hard with disbelief, clinging to the simpler story of good and evil they had been fed. But many others were filled with doubt, with sympathy, with a slow-burning outrage. They looked from Lottie's earnest, tear-streaked face to Brother Josiah's sputtering indignation, and for the first time, they began to question. It was Vickers who broke the spell. He could not allow the truth to take root. He saw his bounty, his reputation, and his chance for revenge all slipping away. "She is a liar," he snarled. Stepping forward, he drew his silver-handled pistol, his good hand moving with practiced speed. He did not point it at Lottie, but at Eli. "He has seduced her, filled her head with blasphemy to save his own skin. He is a condemned man, and she is a fallen woman. This is an affront to God." The first fat drops of rain began to fall as Vickers raised his gun. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Eli was already drawing his own weapon, pushing through the crowd to get to Lottie, to shield her with his body. A gunshot cracked through the air, and the rain began to pour down in earnest. It was not Vickers' gun, nor Eli's. A man in the crowd, a burly blacksmith whose wife was weeping openly, had fired a hunting rifle into the air. "Hold on now," the blacksmith bellowed, his voice a clap of thunder. "Let the girl speak. We have heard enough from you, Vickers." But Vickers was beyond reason. He saw his authority challenged, his narrative crumbling. With a roar of fury, he leveled his pistol at Eli. "To hell with all of you!" The street erupted into chaos. Vickers fired, and Eli felt a familiar, searing pain rip through his left shoulder, the same one that had been grazed before. He stumbled, his vision blurring, but he brought his own gun up and fired back. His shot caught Vickers in the leg, sending the bounty hunter howling to the ground. Brother Josiah's grim-faced guard, the man who had stood by the wagon, drew his shotgun. But before he could raise it, several men from the crowd surged forward, tackling him and wresting the weapon from his hands. The people of Providence, who had been cowed into silence for so long, had finally found their voice, and it was a roar of collective fury. Eli sank to one knee, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, his blood mixing with the mud in the street. Lottie was at his side in an instant, her hands pressing against his wound, her face a mask of terror. "Eli!" she cried. He looked up and saw a strange and beautiful sight. A circle of townsfolk, men and women both, had formed around them. They were not looking at him with suspicion or hatred, but with concern. The blacksmith stood over them, his rifle held ready, his eyes daring anyone else to make a move. The sheriff, looking utterly bewildered, was being urged by several women to arrest a cowering Brother Josiah. The tide had turned. Lottie's truth, spoken with a clear and trembling voice, had been more powerful than all of Vickers' lies. In the aftermath, the whole sordid business unraveled, with Brother Josiah and Vickers in custody, and with half the town as witnesses. The story of the bride auctions could no longer be denied. The remaining girls in the wagon were freed, taken in by the town's families, who were now shamed into a fierce, protective kindness. Word was sent to the territorial marshal, and the pious crusade was officially and permanently disbanded. Eli's wound was tended to by the same doctor who had once dismissed him. It was a clean shot, the bullet passing through the fleshy part of his shoulder. He spent a week recovering, with Lottie rarely leaving his side. One afternoon, a delegation of women, led by the blacksmith's wife, came to visit. They were kind, respectful, and deeply grateful. "Miss Cutler," the woman said, her voice gentle, "you are a hero in this town. We owe you a great debt. We have arranged for you to travel to a mission in Santa Fe, one run by good women. It is a place where you can be safe, where you can heal and begin a new life, a proper life." It was a generous offer, a path back to the world she had been stolen from. It was a chance for safety, for respectability, for peace. Lottie looked at the kind faces of the women, and then she looked at Eli, who was watching her, his expression carefully neutral. He would not choose for her. This was her decision alone. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Your kindness means more to me than I can say, but my place is here." The woman looked surprised. "Here, but child, what will you do?" Lottie reached out and took Eli's hand. "I will stay with him," she said simply. Her words held no hint of obligation or desperation. They were the calm, clear words of a woman who knew her own heart. Not as a runaway girl in need of saving, but as a woman who has made her own choice. The women left, looking confused, but respecting her decision. When they were gone, Eli looked at Lottie, his eyes full of an emotion he could not name. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low. "Life with me will not be easy. I am still a man with no proper name." "Then we will make one for you," she said, squeezing his hand. As dusk fell that evening, the rain finally stopped. A cool, clean air settled over the town, and the setting sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet streets in hues of gold and rose. They stood together under the porch roof of the livery stable, the place where it had all begun. The world was quiet. The only sound the soft drip of water from the eaves. Their hands were clasped together, a comfortable, solid weight. Eli looked out at the transformed sky, then down at her face, at the quiet strength and the gentle light in her eyes. A slow smile touched his lips, a real smile that erased the weary lines around his eyes. "You can't save a virgin twice," he said again, the words soft, almost a whisper. He reached out with his free hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "But you can love her better the second time around." Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.